Live. All right. We are live. Everyone, welcome to QuaranCon 2022. I'm so excited to bring you our very first panel, which is Strong Protagonists Who Aren't Warriors, which is such a cool topic. And we have some absolutely amazing authors and readers, reviewers to talk to you about this topic. Before we get started, a quick reminder that we ask all of our participants, be they audience members, panelists, moderators, etc., to please check out our code of conduct and make sure you're cool with it. You can find it on our website, which is QuaranCon2020.com, and the code of conduct is at /code of conduct. So please check that out before we start. Also, we've got a massive 99-cent and free book sale happening from today to the end of the con. There are over 60 books in it from authors within the con and without of the con. Please check that out. Lots of excellent books in there, like really amazing titles, and they're all super cheap. And the most you could spend would be like $60. So dive into that and check that out. That is at QuaranCon2020.com/book sale. And I think that's everything I need to be talking about before we actually dive into the meat of our topic here. Again, this is Strong Protagonists Who Aren't Warriors. And I am actually going to have all of our super awesome panelists introduce themselves. So we are going to go ahead and go with, I was going to do it in the order on my screen, but that might still be confusing. So let's go with alphabetical order. So Elisa, you're up first. I think.
I love alphabetical order. Hi, everybody. I'm Elisa. So I'm a debut author. My novel Dauntless, which you can see a cover of right here, is coming out in July. So that releases on July 19. And because publishing can be fun, I am actually debuting and sophomoring in the same year. So my second book, Stolen City, which is also YA fantasy, but set in a completely different world from Dauntless, comes out on September 20. Yeah. So
awesome. Can you give us one skill that you have that is a non-combat skill that you're proud of?
I'm very good at time management, which I think a lot of people are not good at this. But so, you know, a little bit of context. I'm autistic, and I think that's like my autistic special interest is figuring out where I'm going to be at every minute of every day, which is a bit stressful sometimes when I'm not where I think I'm going to be. But I've gotten really good at breaking down my day into like 30-minute chunks. So.
That is so cool. That is not my superpower at all, and I am very jealous of the time management piece. I have ADHD, and I'm the opposite. I am the worst at time management. Okay, so next up, according to alphabetical order, would be Krithika.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm Krithika. It's pronounced like Ithaca, and I'm sure you'll get the hang of it as we keep talking. I've lived in many different parts of the world. I've lived in Australia, in India, in the Sultanate of Oman, and right now I live in the very cold city of Calgary in Canada. It is very cold here. It is always very cold here. I write adult science fiction and fantasy, usually epic science fantasy, and my debut book, The Surviving Sky, is coming out in October. It doesn't have any warriors, but it has engineers and architects and archaeologists, which I think is super cool because it is still epic fantasy. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to this session.
Yay. And do you have a non-combat special skill that you would like to share with us?
Virginia, I love how you're asking me that as though I actually have combat skills. Like I don't. All my skills are non-combat.
I assume that everyone here is a master martial artist, of course. And then, you know.
But the one that I'm really proud of is that I can cook a mean butter chicken, even though I'm a vegetarian.
That is impressive. Do you also make a tofu butter chicken that you can eat?
I do. Yeah, that's one I can actually eat.
That sounds really good.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so after Krithika, sorry, I'm bad at alphabetical order, but I believe Neil is next, if I'm not incorrect.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. So I'm Neil. I'm the Mejay of Fime on Twitter. I run a small book blog called Al. I can't pronounce the name Al. It's based off a Moorish castle that was based in Spain, which was very renowned for its architecture. Yeah, that one.
Okay.
So I run a small gaming YouTube channel and I review books where I try to go for, well, fantasy settings that aren't essentially medieval Europe. But I think I've been sort of 50-50 in that degree. But otherwise, I run it. That's me.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And do you have a special non-combat skill that you're proud of?
I'm very diplomatic.
Excellent. That's a very useful skill. All right, next up, I think, is Patty.
Hi, I'm Patty. I live in Southern California. It's beautiful here. It's very hot here right now. I read historical fiction, science fiction, a little fantasy, a little contemporary fiction. I write science fiction in the science fantasy realm. I'm a self-published author. I have 2 titles on Amazon and currently working on others. And those titles draw on my background in climate science, which I spent 12 years on at Caltech. So my heroes are all about environmental issues. They do not pick up a whole lot of swords. And in fact, I don't have any guns on my world at all, which I'm very proud of. And my non-combat super skill is you can drop me just about anywhere in the wilderness and I will be able to triangulate and work my way out of the wilderness because I'm an avid hiker.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
I have nothing else to add to that, but that's a really cool skill. Okay, and let's see if I can keep going. LMNOPQRS. All right, Shauna.
Hey, hello, I'm Shauna. My book is coming out on the 1st of September this year. It's called The Children of Gods and Fighting Men, which is a historical fantasy set in 10th century Ireland, which is where I'm from. So my main interests are historical fiction and fantasy, and I sort of use them together.
That sounds super cool. You're from 10th century Ireland? That's awesome.
Yes, I am. That's actually my skill. I was going to say it's time travel.
Very, very cool. Well played.
Yeah.
But what is your actual non-combat skill that you're proud of?
Yeah, I don't know. I found that hard to come up with. I have 3 children, 3 boys, with lots of energy, and I somehow make them do what I want them to do. So
that is a very important skill and a very useful skill. Excellent. Well played. All right, Thomas, you're up.
Hello, I'm Thomas Howard Riley. I am an author of We Break Immortals, a
doorstop of a book.
Yes, it is. It's epic dark fantasy. I call it rated R, epic fantasy. I read both science fiction and fantasy, but I write exclusively fantasy. I live in the wonderful deserts of Arizona, where it is incredibly hot. And I guess my skill, I guess it's a dual skill. I play guitar and I am involved in the proper care and maintenance of cats.
Those are both awesome skills. Wow, awesome. Okay, well, so that's me. I'm last. I am Virginia McLean, founder of QuaranCon and author of 8 books to date that are out and published. Many books that have not seen the light of publishing and will not as well. I live in the even colder part of Canada than Calgary, which is Winnipeg, Manitoba, also known as Winterpeg. But Thomas, I last lived in Arizona before I moved here. So
oh, no kidding. So you really made a switch there.
Yeah, it was a huge switch. Lots of people are like, wait, why did you do that?
Well, if anybody's lived here for more than a minute, they know exactly why you did that.
Well, there's also that. The Canadians, however, are like, wait, sorry, you were in the desert and you came here. Also, like where I was living in Sedona, there were a lot of Winnipeggers who come down. You see a lot of Manitoba plates in northern Arizona. Anyway, but yeah, I've actually spent more years living in Arizona than any other place. But I have moved around a lot. Krithika, when you were saying that, I was like, yes, I know that feeling of the many homes. Anyway, welcome everybody. I'm so excited for this. I mean, y'all heard those introductions. We have such a fantastically talented and interesting group of people here. I'm going to do my best to not talk much after this introduction point because y'all have fabulous things to say. So we're gonna start on some of the topics that we brought up beforehand. This is like to the panelists, everyone who's here in the audience. Thank you for coming, by the way. We are going to talk about some predetermined topics first, and then we'll answer audience questions at the end. So if y'all who are watching, if you have any questions that come up, please pop them into the live chat as you think of questions, and then we will set aside time towards the end of the panel to answer them all. So you can throw those in there whenever, and that's amazing. And by the way, hello to Anita and Lois and Rachel and Karen and Uri and Tyler and Ilyak, I'm not actually sure, and maybe that's Ilya K, and Trish and everybody else who's watching. Thank you so much for being here. Just like to say hi to the people who've actually bothered to say hi in the chat. Okay, we're gonna dive right in. I think kind of the principal idea behind this panel is largely related to our first question. So we're going to start with that. Sure, it's easy to look like a badass when you're swinging a sword around and lobbing fireballs at people, but what are some of our favorite examples of non-warrior protagonists? We'll start with that because it's nice and fun talking about favorites, and it'll, I think, help us ease into the topic. Anyone who would like to reply is welcome to go ahead, and then we'll just sort of go around after the first person goes. Anybody want to jump in? Yeah, Kritika.
So there's so many examples, and it's really hard to kind of pinpoint favorites, which I think all of us will struggle with at some point, or also to say this is like my least favorite thing, because when you kind of put on the spot, you're just like, okay, I can remember nothing now.
What books have I read?
I know, and I don't think I've read anything at all. But these examples to me really kind of stayed with me when I read them, and one of them is Mahit in A Memory Called Empire. She's not a warrior, she's an ambassador, she's a scholar, and the book itself is very much epic fantasy or epic science fantasy, and in some cases it's been categorized as science fiction as well. But yeah, no fireballs, no swords. You have Meher in An Empire Called Sand by Tasha Suri. Again, she's a dancer, and that's epic fantasy. So, I mean, there's all these beautiful directions that, you know, science fiction and fantasy is really going in. Recently, I read an arc of Book Eaters by Sanya Dean. It's coming out in August, I believe. And the main character, Devin, she's a mom. She is a vampire who eats books. And again, no swords, no like lobbing fireballs. And honestly, there's just so many examples. And you can look at like even way back, and these are all recent books that I'm talking about, but Michael Crichton, I don't think really wrote warriors at all. And things like Jurassic Park, etc., it's always researchers and scientists. And
yeah,
you know, it's just rife, I think, science fiction and fantasy with non-warrior.
And Michael Crichton, interestingly, I think, like kills a lot of the warrior characters he's got
exactly. Yeah.
really soon. Yeah. People are like, oh, I'm going to solve this problem with blunt force, and then they're gone in the first couple
I
chapters.
I love that because it really shows like a nuance of a narrative, right? Like when you can pull that off, you can kind of go, instead of hitting something head on, but like, you know, find a plot solution through some back alleyway. So yeah,
it was very cool. Those are all excellent examples. Would anyone else like to contribute to this one? There's so many cool things, but we'd love to hear from everybody. Yes, Lisa.
I mean, Kritika kind of took my one answer that I'd been sitting on this whole time, but Mahit from A Memory Called Empire is fantastic. Mm-hmm. And I just literally read this book last week, not for this panel, but just because it had been sitting on my shelf for a while, and I was really engrossed in the story. I do not have a whole lot of other examples built into my brain because I am coming out of my stabby gremlin phase where I needed every book to have sword fights and people beating each other up. But I think I'm starting to get an appreciation for characters that can be strong and forces to be reckoned with without necessarily beating people up and having epic fight scenes. And so on that note, I think also Malini from The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri, she is definitely in a world where people do fight, and one of the other main characters has these supernatural powers. But even though she spends like half the book sick, She is definitely still a force to be reckoned with. And I don't think anybody can get away from reading that book and not feel that she has this really strong personality that sort of changes the way the story moves around her. So, yeah.
Very cool.
I just dive in to say, I think that's something that Tasha Suri really specializes in. Like, her characters are always like, they're not, specifically combative or warrior, they're not the warrior class of characters at all. Like, they do all these amazing, like, different things. And somehow they're also incredibly strong. Like you said, she spends her time being sick for most of it, and then in An Empire Called Sand, the main character is a dancer and also is living under like these situations which are not ideal, and strength is something that is so unique, and the way that Tasha really portrays them is just incredible. Like, I love her. She's awesome.
Yeah. I think this leads into one of the other topics we were going to talk about, which we can always come back to favorites later. So let's maybe dive into that. It had been brought up in our chat, like why we find it somewhat cathartic maybe at times to write warrior characters, but then the ways in which it's satisfying to read non-warrior characters too, which I think is like what made me think of it was, Elisa, you talking about you were in a stabby gremlin phase, like you wanted to be reading all the the really like super strong and lots of fight scenes type books for a little while. And I do feel like personally, like I go through phases where that's a thing that I want to read and write, but then the immense satisfaction of seeing other forms of strength, like Krithika was talking about. So like, do we want to start on that topic a bit and talk about the other forms of strength and why that is so satisfying as well? Anybody who wants to jump in on that?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a whole different dynamic to characters who are not a warrior, classified generally. The kind of situations and tension that you can build are different. Not to say that warrior characters do not have tension, but when you have a character who is a warrior, they're going to be a badass. They're going to be able to go into a situation with supreme confidence, and they'll run into troubles that way. But I find it's very interesting to write a character who is not that, who like it's a totally different dynamic if you have a character who has never lifted a sword before, who suddenly has to lift a sword, because with a warrior, they're going to at least know how to use the sword. But with this other character, they might screw up completely. They might not be able to get the job done. They might have to go a different direction. So even a non-warrior character trying to be a warrior is in and of itself a fun dynamic to play with. But I really get a kick out of mental chess matches between characters, and so I think characters finding clever ways to outdo and make up for the things that they are lacking, physically or skill wise, can make for some awesome cathartic moments, honestly.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like there's seeing those non-violent, or maybe not even non-violent, because sometimes it is violence to attack people in ways that aren't physical, but to see those other non-physically violent confrontations and the way that characters do that, but even the different forms of strength entirely that aren't even about combat or physically harming another person, but more about your own inner resilience.
Yes, sometimes the most profound form of courage is simply to not give up, like the strength to go on through whatever it is you have to do. I look at Lord of the Rings, which is known for being about swords, and its primary character is not a warrior at all, and their their skill is their charisma, their ability to generate sympathy from others who do have swords in order to get to where they need to go, and using their strength to just go on in the face of what's insurmountable.
Yeah.
For somebody who's not a warrior, that takes a lot of strength,
right?
To because you don't have that same armor or the same weapons that your the lizard brain part of you thinks is necessary to get the job done. But
yeah,
you still.
What are some other folks' opinions on those other types of strength, and like getting like characters who endure, who are persistent, who who love in the face of a hateful world, things like that. What are some of those examples? Go ahead, Patty. Yeah.
I have one that so to touch back to your previous question, I think the reason we find warriors compelling is because the stakes and the lines are so clear. It's always an external threat. You know, with the sword in hand, we know who the hero is, we know who the villain is. It's so clear. The other strength, and I think this leads into the idea of an external threat versus an internal threat. So I think some of the interesting characters are the ones who are fighting isn't really the right word, but sort of examining, exploring, and growing with their own internal challenges. And the character I would point to is from an older book by Octavia Butler. She wrote a book called Kindred, which is about a Black woman in the, I believe it was set in the 1990s. I believe that's when it came out. But she time slipped, she time traveled back to her ancestors' plantation, where, because she was an African American, she was quickly brought into the slave culture. And she would go back and forth between these times. So this character who grew up in the United States in the 1990s with the culture as it was at that point, now is in this very different culture. And so she has to, she has ideas, those ideas are challenged. It turns out the slave owner was her great grandfather. So she's faced with all of these conundrums that she has to work through as part of her own identity and understanding of culture. And she wasn't a warrior at all. She just had to figure out how she would, you know, survive, persist.
Yeah.
She's fascinating.
Yeah, those other conflicts, those non-violent conflicts can be really interesting and inspiring, I think, in a lot of ways. And I don't mean just that example, but any of them, like, but persistent characters and characters who endure and go through a lot of internal turmoil, I think.
I also really enjoy writing characters who are in conflict with themselves.
Yeah.
And have to overcome their own, you know, their own obsessions, their own prejudices, and in order to get things done.
Yeah. Kritika.
I just kind of want to jump in on Patty's point as well. Like, I think this is actually true of a lot of like BIPOC stories and stories that authors of color tend to tell. You do have this sense of like agency and, you know, strength, etc., that make its way into a lot of like Western traditional story structures, but you have a lot of other story structures which rely so much on their internal strength, right? Like strength beyond the physical. Things like survival and endurance and acceptance, and all of these things are the conflict, are the points that bring conflict and the turning points of a story. So I think there's so much space in science fiction and fantasy and generally in literature just to kind of explore all of those areas. And I feel like also in traditional stories written by science fiction and fantasy writers in terms of like Western traditions, I see that move kind of happening. Like the Stormlight Archives is such a good example of that, especially because like you have the main character Kaladin, who is a soldier, but is also dealing with depression, and half the cast of Stormlight Archives is like main characters who are dealing with some form of mental illness, etc. So there's, you know, you have the swords and you have the magic and you have all of those cool things, but the main thing that connects everybody is this internal endurance and strength and acceptance and all of those things. So, you know, strength beyond the physical, I think, is such an important piece to kind of explore in science fiction and fantasy, and with newer voices coming into the genre, with, you know, people exploring all of these different areas in ways that they haven't before, or ways that, you know, kind of we've been stuck in that way for like decades, and now we're seeing this new method of things happening. Like I'm so excited about it because it just tells richer stories, doesn't it?
Totally. Yeah. If anything, I mean, inner turmoil, I think, has always been a great way to show character, right? And in any story, but it's now, I love that it's moving to the forefront, and that we're not just as accepting of, oh, here's the hero with the sword, and they're obviously the good guy. And it was interesting to Patty, you mentioned that like when the hero is holding the sword and they're going into battle, that it is so clear. But one thing that I've loved as a trend recently is even making that less clear, right? That the person who thinks they're the hero with the sword and is charging into battle actually the hero? Or are they actually the aggressor and don't even recognize it, right? Or, I mean, and what is the line there? And it all, like, obviously a huge amount of it depends on perspective and stuff. But we're still sort of, in talking about that, focusing a little more on the person with the sword than those without. So what are do you think there's a genre division there, or there's certain genres that prop up non-warrior characters more or less? Like, do you think, I think it came up in our conversation, someone was struggling to come up with examples of non-warrior characters in fantasy, but had an easier time coming up with them in SF or in sci-fi. What do y'all think about that? Do you think that there's actually an even split? I mean, I have seen a trend in fantasy of moving that way now, but do you think that trend has already been around in some other SFF genres, or what? I'm happy to hear anybody talk about it, but especially maybe Shauna and Neil, who haven't said much yet.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, I think the warrior has featured so heavily in fantasy because it's something in reality we can't see anymore so much. Maybe not like in democracies. So it is a little bit of maybe like wish fulfillment, or maybe it is exploring kind of part of ourselves, maybe a more violent or primal part of ourselves that we can't actually do in real life. You know, if we, you know, one of my favorite historical fiction series is the Last Kingdom series. You know, Uhtred of Bebbanburg is a fantastic character, but if you were to behave like him in real life now, you would be arrested. You know, so I think kind of the older historical fictions and fantasies have been a really good genre to explore those themes without having to make it too real, which is when you get to maybe more modern historical fiction, which are based on recent events. They're actually quite traumatic to read. They can be upsetting. You know, The Star of the Sea is a book by Joseph O'Connor, which is about Irish immigrants traveling during the famine. And that's really, really upsetting to read because that's something that happens. But if you were to transport that scenario into a fantasy novel, you can kind of analyze it better because it's just not so personal. And I think that's always been the strength of fantasy. But then, of course, I think you're right, Virginia, there has definitely been a move away from the warriors always being the main protagonists. And I think we are looking for strength in other areas.
Yeah.
Perhaps that are more reflective of who we could be in reality.
Right.
As well, you know, and then putting that into a fantastical scenario, and maybe that is becoming more relatable to audiences.
That makes sense. I think it's also historically these characters, these people who have been strong in ways that aren't being a warrior have always existed, right? And in fact are like the backbone of a ton of movements historically, right? And I think it's interesting that as a society right now, or at least as an SFF mini society, like we are embracing that a bit and being like, you know, what's really cool are, you know, these people who were the backbone of this movement that weren't the ones holding the swords, but were still like the reason that this happened or the reason that it went well, you know, like all those things. I think that's really cool. And I like, yeah, I mean, I think part of it is it's a little more realistic to us now, right? Like we're discouraged from putting swords in people these days, you know, as much as I would like to stab my problems to make them go away, that doesn't work on, you know, taxes or people I'm in conflict with, certainly. I put a sword through my laptop, it doesn't really help. But yeah, like it's there are these other things are things we can maybe identify with more now, but also are historically really important. And I kind of like the way those two pieces interweave, because it's not just putting a modern lens on it, it's bringing into focus people who were always there, and I think that's extra cool too. Neil, I haven't heard from you in a while, and I know you were interested in talking about video games, and I think this is maybe a good opportunity to do that, because are we seeing a similar trend in video games as we are in like SFF as a written genre, where we are seeing more non-combat characters take the stage? Is that happening in video games as much? Are we seeing that?
I think we're seeing it to a certain degree. I mean, all the panel they gave really great answers. I was just going to use the example of sci-fi as one of the TV shows that I watch, The Expanse, right?
Oh yeah.
There is Alex Kamal, who is basically one of the pilots for the Martian Navy. And if you watch through his entire character arc, through maybe at least through the first 4 seasons, he's just a normal pilot working on the Canterbury, and then he's transported into this series of crazy adventures that he never asked for.
Right.
That basically split him from his family, etc. You have Naomi Nagata, who is a really great example of a great character, not just because she's female, but because she always tends to do well when there is some sort of emergency crisis.
Yeah.
But when it goes to like dealing with her personal family problems, there's always some sort of XYZ thing. And the other thing that Thomas was talking about when he said, the characters are in a turmoil. I think it would be nice to see a trend in fantasy where characters also learn from their mistakes. So they aren't always broken characters. They are learning, because what do we do as humans? We make mistakes every day. We learn. And then I know I've made many mistakes in my life, which I think if I had a time machine, I would go back and fix everything. But I'm not that fortunate, of course. But and in terms of video games, there was this one which is Horizon Forbidden West and Horizon Complete. I think it's Horizon Complete Dawn, where you have Aloy, who is a completely different character, and she is not a warrior from the start. I don't think she's a warrior from the start, but in gaming, you are mostly seeing characters that do tend to fight because it kind of appeals to the male fantasy in a way. But there are lots of female-orientated games out there. But I think the reason why do we gravitate towards warriors in the first place? Because we as humans, we want someone, not always, but we want to go after someone that is the strongest. That's why we go and say, okay, you're the person that's going to lead us, and we'll put our trust in you, etc. That's the reason why you have all these warriors. And I think it's also because, as you said, right, being a warrior means you can always be the hero, but even if you're the hero, you'll always be a villain in someone else's eye. You will never be a perfect person in this world, because if let's say this, if a government comes into power and they say that from our manifesto we're going to achieve every single thing we said in a 100-point manifesto, it will be physically impossible to do everything, because as much as I think it's like there's this phrase called where you come into this world with nothing, you leave into this world with nothing. The only thing you can do is you can make your life worth living.
Yeah.
So hopefully I haven't gone off topic, but that's my whole thing.
I think that cycles in nicely with what we were talking about, the sort of the satisfaction of violent characters or combat characters to some degree. And then the ways that we're seeking satisfaction with non-combat characters also.
And do you always need to be violent either?
Right. Is it always the reasonable response? I love that you brought up The Expanse, because I think that's a great show and book series. I haven't actually read the books, but I hear they're good too. And it is such a cool, like the main character is definitely not a fighter and then gets thrown into all this stuff, maybe eventually sort of becomes one kind of, but it's very much like a lot of the characters are problem solvers in different ways. And Elisa, we haven't heard from you in a little while, and I thought were you about to speak? And I don't want to cut you off. So.
Oh yeah. Well, I was just talking about the genres that we tend to see like non-warrior protagonists in. I think that when a fantasy story is set, or even a sci-fi story is set in our world, we tend to see more like non-combat protagonists, just because in general, there are less of us walking around with amazing combat powers. It definitely happens. Like sometimes somebody gets the magic sword and ends up like in an urban fantasy, still fighting in the shadows. But more often than not, these stories, especially like magic realism stories, where the magic exists in the world and the characters have to deal with it, tend to have characters who are just dealing with the supernatural or the fantastical event, without necessarily like becoming martial arts masters or whatever the equivalent is in that universe. And I think this is also true in YA and MG science fiction and fantasy that is set in our world, although YA does tend to get a bit stabby. I can definitely
there's a lot of
think
stabbing in
some
YA, I guess that's true.
Yeah. And I think in kids fantasy, like children's fantasy, there's more non-combat protagonists. I remember thinking about The Hobbit. I know we brought up The Lord of the Rings earlier, but like there is fighting in The Hobbit, but Bilbo is mostly just clever. And that's how he gets through most of those situations, by being really smart. So
that's a great point. And has anyone read the Artemis Fowl books? Like Artemis is just wicked smart. Like that's his thing.
Tyrion Lannister too in Game of Thrones fame. All he has is his wits and his planning abilities, things like that.
Totally. Cersei is not really allowed to fight culturally, but boy does she
I think that's so interesting.
Make up for that.
Just you kind of bringing up Westeros, to me, I started to think also about like how gender kind of plays into science fiction and fantasy often. And you do have like, the men going out and, fighting wars and fighting battles, and then women taking on a different kind of strength, although that has kind of changed. I know that, there's just so many examples. Shadow of the Gods, I think, is such a brilliant example of women also kind of picking up arms, and most of the main characters are women. And then you have so many other stories with like non-binary folk who are also warriors. And Hall of Smoke by H.M. Long is a story with Hessa, who is a warrior priestess, and she lobs around axes, etc. So it's kind of moving in that direction. I did also want to jump in on what Neil was saying earlier about Expanse, because I love the Expanse. Like, who doesn't love the Expanse? Oh my God. Like, honestly, like Avasarala is such a good example of strength, which is not, and you just have so many examples all through science fiction and fantasy of non-warrior characters just kicking ass and doing such a fantastic job with, like, as I mentioned, like back alley pathways, and with their wits, and they're clever, and all of that. So to me, like when we start talking about non-warrior characters in SFF, I feel like here's the thing, right? Like all literature, and I think science fiction and fantasy does this so well, is it allows us to imagine the future even through the lens of, like, say, past. Like, even if you are looking at historical fantasy, etc., you can still kind of imagine the future in different ways. And what I love about the shift from warrior into non-warrior is that it allows us to see alternatives to war. Like, I'm seeing way more books now where war is not being glorified, which is awesome because we live in tumultuous times and nobody wants war. But if we can write about different ways, different solutions except war, which has traditionally been, this is a solution, good over evil, kill the orcs, defeat the bad guy or whatever. And that's, nice with a bow on top, and it's all, neat and tidy. But if we can imagine other ways, clever ways to deal with our problems, then I think what we're also doing is offering that solution to our readers and to ourselves, that combat and conflict is not necessarily the only way to deal with your problems. And I think this is what science fiction and fantasy does really well, and is starting to do really well right now, is to look for innovative and inventive ways to be strong. Like, you don't have to be a warrior, you don't have to pick up a gun, you don't have to pick up, like, you can be strong in so many other ways. So and this is why I love The Expanse so much, because it shows very clearly on the screen, like, the bad guy with the biggest guns and the biggest ships and all of that might not necessarily be right.
I have to give a shout out to my favorite non-warrior character of all time while we're on science fiction, Ripley from Aliens, who by that second film is basically, she is she moves heavy equipment. Like, she's basically like a dock worker for all intents and purposes at that point. And she has to use her skills with that, and her skills as just as a planner and to try to succeed in very dark situations. But definitely not a warrior at all.
She certainly doesn't start as one. I'd argue maybe she turns into one, but because she gets put into those physical conflicts over and over again, right? So
right, but that's a regular person rising
totally,
the
yeah,
occasion kind of a scenario, as opposed to, I mean, if you know those movies at all, the actual warrior characters drop real quick. They do not make it very far at all. So
yeah. And I think that is a fun thing to play with, right? The idea of like, oh, here's this non-warrior character who has to sort of rise up to the occasion, but it still sort of puts them in that warrior slot as far as like storytelling goes. But there, I mean, there's all kinds of stories too that we've been talking about that have like the non-warrior characters who remain non-warrior characters. We've touched on two things that I would like to get back to in no particular order except people's excitement for them. Gender bias and non-warrior characters. And well, let's just start with that one. Oh, Patty, yeah? No. What do you got?
Yeah, I'm so excited.
That one. Oh, that was just like enthusiasm.
Yes.
So I will just start by saying I like an example that comes to my mind that I love is some urban fantasy by Rebecca Roanhorse, Trail of Lightning and Storm of Locusts. The main character is a woman who's definitely a warrior, no question about that. But the primary secondary character that we meet is a dude who is like an awesome soft healer type, and I freaking love it. Like that reversal of those positions, I eat it up. And so does anyone have more examples like that or completely different examples? But I love the idea of talking about the way that we often stereotype warrior versus non-warrior in gender categories, although I think we've done a great job of bringing up lots of characters from both all genders that are in different spots of being non-warrior types. But yeah, like Patty, you seem excited. I'm
very excited.
You about like, let's talk about gender and warrior versus non-warrior delineation. Go.
Yeah. So because you asked specifically, I did find a title where the man is the artist. I was looking for an artist, and I'm so excited that Kritika brought up this title I've never heard of, because I was looking specifically for a dancer as a protagonist. So I'm going to look that title up. But when I was looking for an artist archetype who was not a warrior, I came across a character named Brian Pierce in The Memory Painter. The painter, Brian Pierce, paints memories. And it turns out that these memories he's painting get at a mystery. The woman who he interacts with, the woman is actually more of the warrior character. He's more of the artist character. So that sort of relates to your example. But what I'm excited about is this idea of gender roles. And Neil was mentioning that several people have sort of touched on this, and now you're bringing it up. The Power by Naomi Alderman is a fascinating sort of idea where it's science fiction. And in The Power, the story spans about 3,000 years, but the women in the late 20th century, suddenly all the women acquire this power to deliver electrical shock, and the men do not. They trace that back to something in the water in the early 20th century. So now the women now have a tool inherent to them that make them stronger than the men. And the author plays out what that does societally. And it's fascinating. So that sort of gets, you can handle that idea in two different ways. You can say, okay, if women were in charge of society, it would be this way. And we might want, as readers, we might want it to be a utopia, or, having solved all the world's ills. Or as an author, you can take the approach of, if women had strength that men didn't have, and if women dominated in any conflict like that, it would just go the same way with the women on top. And so an author makes that choice as to which way they're going to go. But in either case, it raises interesting points of discussion.
Yeah, playing in absolutes like that can be a very fun sort of thought experiment. Elisa, looked like you had something to say. Sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, just on the gender bias kinds of things. I think that also, I started reading fantasy like really, really young. So I started reading fantasy basically in the late 90s, early 2000s when I was a kid. And then I also got on the internet really early, and I started writing fantasy really early. And I remember being a kid and thinking all fantasy is warriors who fight battles and have epic things. And then like my blood would boil because I would get on internet forums and be like, people would ask these questions like, can a female character have an epic fight scene or be
the sword wielding protagonist. And all of these people would be like, no, absolutely, that could not happen because biologically it's impossible. And
sorry, that's just me melting. Yeah. Go ahead.
When I say I went through a stabby gremlin phase, I mean the stabby gremlin phase was 20 years long because I desperately wanted to see more like female warriors. Like I wanted to write them. I did more than 10 years of martial arts because I wanted to be one. And then it turned out I'm very bad at actually getting hit by swords. And I had to sit and think about how I felt about the fact that I flinch a lot, which, not to get off topic. I definitely think there's a reaction,
by the way, to getting hit with things, but
yeah. I think that there definitely is a gender bias because I think that a lot of the times when we see books that are like, and here's a woman and she has a sword and she's a badass, it's a direct reaction to something that was absent for a long time. But I also, not to say that I also think that there's still value in characters that don't fight, because what I remember is there was also this phase where when you had a female character in a fantasy world who didn't fight, even if she was like strong in other ways, other people would be like, she's not a strong female character because she doesn't punch the bad guy in the face through three walls, right? Like, and that was also frustrating to me because I was like, why can't you be a strong character that like wears pretty dresses and is polite, but is still really a strong personality, right?
Yeah. So I mean, that's an excellent point. I as much as I said I was just going to try not to talk too much, but I freaking love the stabby characters because same thing. Like when I was reading fantasy in my adolescence, I read all these awesome male characters who had great sword talent. And as someone who is interested in fighting myself, I wanted to see me holding the sword because I could hold the sword in real life. So why can't I do it on the page of this fantasy book? And that was a big part of why I started writing the stories that I did, which involve a lot of stabby women. And I still love championing stabby women. But the thing that I have progressed with is like, but to be really awesome, let's also have some really cool non-stabby women and cover even more of the ways in which people are awesome. And non-stabby men too. Healer
I just want to quickly shout out to Melissa Caruso's books, which are essentially like sword fights in ball gowns, and they're amazing. Like they are so good. So they have like women characters who are fighting, and she's done a whole thread on Twitter as well, that it's actually possible in real life to do that.
So, I remember seeing that, the way like skirts would work. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's just like, as I said, like it traditional Western fantasy sometimes tends to like highlight only men doing that, but I like the move that it's being made, towards women as well, and also just like not warriors at all.
Yeah. And that's the thing is like, I want it all. I love stabby characters, but I also love healers and politicians and the librarian who finds the secret to like fixing everything because they're really good at research, like all that stuff. I want it all. Sorry, I'm very excited.
Okay, I think the variety. Sorry, Neil, go ahead. Like,
no, you go ahead. I'll come after.
I mean, it's really quick. I just think the variety is really cool because back in the day, when you buy a fantasy book, a mainstream fantasy book, you're always like, okay, he's the hero, he's got the sword, and he's going to beat that guy who looks evil by the end. But now, because there's more like different types of characters and there's more like politicians, like you said, and healers and non-fantasy type characters, non-fighty type characters in these fantasy books, you are starting to have a harder time predicting where the plot's going to go, which is like really exciting. And I also just want to highlight A Magic Steeped in Poison by Judy Lin. It's a YA fantasy, and it just debuted on the #1 slot in the New York Times. So like, you guys should go check that out. But the main character of that book, Ming, makes tea, and that's her magic. Like she makes tea in a tea making competition, and the tea has magic properties, and that's basically how she gets through the book. And I just thought that was so cool. So
it is awesome. I want to mention Intisar Kanani's books. I don't know if y'all have read her Dauntless Path books, but while we're talking about amazing YA books that have non-warrior characters, the Theft of Sunlight and the one that's coming out really soon, A Darkness at the Door, absolutely fabulous. And the main character is a girl with a club foot from a small town who goes into the big city to take on human trafficking, and is not a warrior and never really becomes one. Though I realize I have to not say anything because I know things about the second book or the next book I'm not allowed to say. Anyway, but absolutely amazingly written, and everyone should check those out as well. Just super cool, and like a bunch of secondary characters who are also non-combatants, but also there are plenty of stabby people in it too, because that's always fun too. But another good recommendation for that. I'm going to look at audience questions while y'all answer one more question from our list, because we are getting close to time. So let's actually, everybody now gets a chance to talk about your own writing. So do you enjoy writing combatants, non-combatants, a mixture of both? What do you love? Why do you love it? And
I definitely love both, Virginia. I love both. In my own book, well, actually, I have three main characters. Only one of them is a warrior character. The other two are, one is a thief and one is basically a forensic scientist, for lack of a better term, thrust into a fantasy world or environment. So I really enjoy writing characters of both. I really tend to lean towards characters who are not natural warriors, because it, like we discussed before, it opens up a whole different set of dynamics with characters. So where they have to use their brains basically to like defuse situations that their bodies can't deal with.
I love, Thomas, that you said that you're like writing both, because I almost exclusively do not write warriors, like at all. Like I will never write warriors. It is just not my forte. Like my debut book, The Surviving Sky, has like magical architects, it's got archaeologists, it's got engineers. And so for me, I feel like battle and action scenes actually tend to bore me just a little bit, and I end up skipping and skimming past them and just tell me who won. Like that's all I want to know. I don't want to know, all the fighty bits. Unless it's done like in a way which, you kind of show the magic through battles, or there's a plot point or a character element or a world building element that kind of comes through those action scenes. So to me, that makes it super enjoyable.
I definitely like to have flawed warriors, even when I do have warriors, because, you can get into all kinds of things where you talk about, is the violence that they're performing, is it even useful? Or is it causing as many problems as it's setting out to solve? My primary warrior character is mostly a comic relief, but in the sequel there's a character that definitely violence is his go-to, and it ends up causing problems both for himself and for others throughout the story. So
making it worse, digging his own hole. But Kritika, were you done with your point?
The only other thing I wanted to say is in those action scenes, like when I said it kind of makes it enjoyable if there's some kind of reveal or mystery or something about the magic or just something else besides just a plain or fight scene. Like to me, that is really what makes it interesting. H.M. Long does this really well in Hall of Smoke. There's a little bit of magic always shown through battles, and it is a very warrior heavy book. The main character is a warrior priestess. But the way that those action scenes kind of come out, there's a lot of magic as well that happens in those scenes. So for me personally, I enjoy reading that more, even if I don't specifically write like warriors at all. Like I will always look for an alternative to warrior class.
I think I write more magic battles than I do regular battles. Because part of my magic system is about people using different types of magic to outdo one another's magic, because it's all based on like physics formulas, basically.
I love that. See, that to me is like ideal.
People can not only use, their form of attack versus another, they can also use other forms of rewriting physics to like outmaneuver or outdo what someone else is doing. I really like that. It's fairly obvious that I'm into playing chess, because I really love
Shauna, we haven't heard from you in a while. Would you like to talk a little bit about what you prefer to write?
Yeah, so my story, there is a lot of battles, but my two protagonists are female who are like surrounded by warriors. And so they initially feel like they don't have much of a say or an input, but to try and change their destinies, they have to use the other skills that they have. So one of my characters is very politically astute. She's very good at seeing the bigger picture, what people really want versus what they say they want. And so because she is so clever, she ends up able to manipulate situations to her advantage. And then I have another character who I suppose her strength is her love for her family and that she wants them to succeed. She's like a very selfless person. And that character was very important for me to write because we've spoken about female characters. If you want a strong female character, they need to be a warrior or maybe a politician or a queen. But I know lots of strong women and I don't know any women that are any of those three groups of people. Right. So I really wanted to have a strong female character who I know and I think other people will know, but she isn't conventionally strong. But I think the fact that she is selfless, that she tries always to make the right decision for everybody is how she actually ends up getting her way or succeeding in the end.
That's a lovely note. And honestly, like we're so close to out of time, but I totally wish that we'd had time to talk about vulnerability as strength, because that was one of our like awesome topics. We have too many cool things to say, and now we only have 3 minutes left. So I'm just going to let everybody else say a quick thing about either their own work, or if you want to jump in on vulnerability as strength, you can do that. But we're down to like the wire here. So let's just hear from Patty, Elisa, and Neil, and then I've got to wrap things up. So. But yeah.
I'll just go real quick. I think that the internal struggles that characters go through are as interesting, if not more interesting, than the external struggles. And I think strength comes from within.
Awesome. Lisa?
Yeah, I'm team both. I'm very firmly on team both because I told you my entire backstory. So I was raised on a steady glut of like epic fantasy and anime. So there will always probably be some kind of epic fight scene in my secondary world fantasy. But I'm learning to appreciate characters that don't do it. And in the books that I am allowed to talk about, the characters do a lot of fighting, but perhaps in future books, that may not necessarily always be the case. And that's all I'm going to say on that.
And Neil, if you wanted to hop in and talk about your preferences as a reader and reviewer, do you prefer the non-combat characters? Do you prefer the stabby characters, or do you like both?
Basically, I'll just put it like this. If I relate to the character at the end of the day, then I'm on their journey. But if the character is boring, then I'll skip a couple of pages. But to quickly summarize, if you write a good character and I get invested in it, then consider me on board. But if it's not, then I'm out.
That seems perfectly fair. And at the end of the day, I think that's like sort of the backbone of a good story. We definitely have some people have made some very interesting comments in the live chat. If y'all get a chance to check that out later and want to reply to things, maybe you can reply in the permanent comments. The chat will wind up closed after the end of our broadcast here. We have 1 minute left, so I'm down to wrapping things up. Thank you, panelists, so much for coming. This was an amazing topic, and I really wish we had like 2 more hours to keep talking about it because it's so interesting. And we have so much more we could say. But thank you so much for your time. It's always amazing to have these conversations, and I hope that the audience found it as interesting as I did. Audience, thank you for coming. Thank you for commenting. I appreciate the chat that was going on in the live chat, and I hope that we'll all get a chance to poke through those and maybe reply to some comments. There weren't too many direct questions, and the one that we had, we don't really have time to answer. But hopefully we can talk more about this later. Maybe if we do CornCon again next year, then we should definitely do like a part 2 of this so we can keep going. And everyone, please check out our next event is the Underrepresented Mythologies panel that starts at 1 p.m. my time, that's Central Time, and you'll have to go check the schedule to figure out all the other times that it happens, and double check that. Again, please check out our 99-cent and free book sale. Go to our website to find merch and all kinds of other fun stuff. Thank you all so much for being here. And I am going to just be hitting the big red button that ends our stream. But thank you.
Thank you, Virginia, for organizing everything.
Yes, thank you, Virginia. This was amazing.
Thank you, Virginia.
And thanks, everybody.
You're amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm ending the stream.